Living Room Logic. Okay, everyone, welcome back to yet another episode of Living Room Logic, and today I am very excited to be with Dr. Claire Watson. Thank you so much, Claire, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Aidan. Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Watson is Marai's Engagement Research Support Officer. She's a social scientist and an environmental campaigner. She's also co-author of the book Campaigns and How to Win Them. So, Dr. Watson, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your research interests?
Sure. I mean, I trained as a social worker many moons ago, and then I have spent years kind of involved in environmental groups and projects, and a lot of them at community level. And in fact, when I wrote that book, I have to say it was in the late 1990s, so I'm surprised that you've dug it out. But it was, I was very involved in campaigning, and particularly on environmental issues. And we realised actually that a lot of people didn't quite know how to do it. And we, of course, thought we were doing it very well. I used to work with Greenpeace, so I'd learned a lot of tricks of the trade. Okay. So we put the book together then. And then since then, I moved to live on a small hill farm in West Cork near Bantry. And my partner and I built a straw bale house. We put up a wind generator. We had solar panels. So we really went into kind of the techie, low carbon life. And it was a bit of a version of the good life. So we grew our own vegetables. We had various different animals. And we experimented with how you could be self-sufficient, really. And I think after maybe, 15 years of that, we realized, gosh, this is hard work. And not everyone is going to want to do it. And we were kind of evangelists for it. And we were feeling, we can do it and we're doing the right thing, and so everyone will follow us. So we would have open walks around the farm. We did a lot of publicity, and my partner then, he actually went up for election for the Green Party. So we were very keen to get the message across, and this was kind of in the 2007, 2008. We were really kind of out there talking about climate change and about the importance of respecting and protecting the environment. And at one point I just kind of stopped and I said, this is crazy. The only people we're talking to is people like ourselves. So we'd organize an event. I remember we showed the Al Gore's The Inconvenient Truth film. We showed it around West Cork in various venues. And really only the same people that we knew already were turning up, people who already knew the issues and were really, really interested and were probably doing quite a bit about it themselves. And I thought, gosh, there's something going on here. We're not reaching out to the wider population. And so, of course, then in my judgmental way, I said, what's wrong with everyone? Why don't they get it? Are they fools? And then I thought, come on, Claire, now let's do a little bit of internal thinking here. So I started reading, and I, because of my social work kind of background, I'm interested in psychology and in behavior. So I started reading any book that I could get a hold of really at the time. And then I put together a blog, which I called Chasing Hubcaps. So I put up about 21 articles online. And it was really for the environmental movement, because I felt that it was us that wasn't getting it, that we were kind of preaching to the converted, and we were preaching in a way that made people feel blamed or shamed or felt guilty, and they felt judged by us, So I kind of produced the blog so that internally in the environmental movement we could have a debate about this, which didn't really happen actually. I think people don't often want to think that they're doing the wrong thing or they're taking the wrong approach. We kind of believe we're doing it right, which is another psychological flaw. But so in the end I thought, look, I've got to be more organised about this. So I approached UCC and I ended up doing a PhD on the topic, looking at, how do you engage people in climate action? And I focused particularly on community energy. So that got me into UCC and Marai, and then I have stayed there, and I'm part of an engaged research team working with the Great Dingle Peninsula 2030 project.
So could you tell me, do the Irish public have a good understanding of environmentalism and climate change? Has our perception of the environment and the climate changed in recent decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a huge shift, because I've been around this issue probably for about 30 years. And I would have noticed a huge change, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years. And I think this has been backed up by research by the EPA and ESRI, where they've showed, up to 96% of Irish people know that climate change is happening. So that is a very clear kind of
very
sense
high.
that, And, 85% are worried about it. and maybe, what is it, 90% feel that Ireland has a responsibility to do something about it. Now, the ESRI report said it was slightly different. They said 70% of adults are worried, but it's very high, if you take those percentages. Where the difficulty is if you drill down then into what people think or know that they can do about it. There's a less of an understanding around what are the activities that cause the greatest damage, and what are the most important actions that people can do. So that's where we're much fuzzier. I mean, I think one of the bigger problems with climate change is it's what they call a wicked problem. So it's very complicated, it's multifaceted, it affects really all aspects of our lives and what we do and how we live. And there's no one easy solution. So it's not like the hole in the ozone layer, for instance. We learned that, it was aerosols were the problem, so we had to cut out the problem, and then we see that there is a change happening. Climate change is much more complex. And then if you look at energy transitions, like we're being asked to move from the use of fossil fuels into renewable energy, but that's very complex because, our whole system, our infrastructure, our technology is all set up, even our roads, they're all set up for us to be driving, to be using fossil fuels. So you not only have to change the technology, you have to change the way we get the new technology and the way we use it, so the learning curve is quite large. The other problem is climate change it seems very out there, so for certainly for the first kind of 20 years when we were talking about it, it seemed distant to people. We were talking about the polar ice caps, or the poor old polar bears, and the melting up in the Arctic, and big storms somewhere else, and it would come to us down the line. And as humans, we're not very good at looking at things that are way in the distant, because we don't necessarily prepare for the future. We live for the here and now. We live in the present. So it's hard for us to think, okay, we have to do this so that we prepare for the future. So the message, it'll affect your grandchildren, probably stuck with a lot of people, because they thought, oh, sure, that's grand. That's miles down the road. We'll fix it before then. It'll be great, So it didn't mean that you had to do any action right now. We're also more likely to respond if the problem is in our faces, So if it's immediate, if it's vivid, we are more likely to jump and do something about it because it's directly there. And for instance, if someone said to you, look, be careful, there's a hole in front of you, don't fall into it, I would say, oh, sure, I know, of course I won't, because I know what will happen if I fall into it, and I also know how to avoid it, so I can walk around it. So of course I do what I'm told with that. And to some extent with the pandemic, we very clearly knew what we had to do, and the messaging was clear. Protect yourself, protect your friends. This is how you do it. This is what you need to do. And we were given very clear guidelines about wearing masks. With climate change, it's really much more complicated. We're basically asking people to change our lifestyles,
Everything that we do, and how we heat our homes, and how we charge our phones, and everything in our house.
And how we drive, and how we collect our kids. And you see, a lot of our actions, initially, very basically, they're driven by habits. So we drive our car, we don't even think about it. We get in, we start the engine, and off we go. And sometimes because if it's a routine journey we're taking, we don't even think about where we're going, because we know it. It's in the back of our heads, in our subconscious. So a lot of what we do is habit driven. A lot of what we do is
kind of autopilot.
And routine, and this is what I do, and I'm used to doing it this way. And it's actually quite hard for us to suddenly say, okay, I'm going to stop doing it this way and I'm going to go this way. You have to make a very concerted decision and then work out how you're going to change it. But the other thing we're influenced by, and a lot of us probably won't admit it, is that we are influenced by other people around us. We're influenced by peer pressure. What will they think if I do this? I don't want to be seen as a bad parent if I don't drive my kid to school, or if I let them walk in the rain. You feel you're being watched, and you don't necessarily want to do something that's different from the herd. And you also are kind of influenced by social norms. So we do things because we kind of are expected by society to do them. And we know implicitly like what not to do. So for instance, I'm not going to poke my nose now, particularly because I'm on camera, but I just know that's not acceptable. And it would be rude if I did it here. Or, I'm
Yeah.
not just going to stand up and walk out of this interview. That's rude.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that we know we're expected to do. So we're expected to have clean clothes. If we don't, it shows that we're not making an effort and we're shoddy or whatever, or we're
Okay.
poor. And none of us want to appear that we're not making an effort, or we don't necessarily want to show that we're poor. So
Yeah.
that means we have to wash our clothes a lot to keep them clean, particularly with kids. So we're using the washing machine more. So if we're asking
Yeah.
people to cut back, we have to see what social practice is involved in the action we're asking them to do. And we have to help people look at that.
And then it falls down to us trying to change our perception of that, is it?
Yeah, and I mean, I think what I'm learning over the last definitely the last 5 to 6 years is that it's very hard to expect people to act on their own. So, I don't know if you remember, there was a campaign called The Power of One, and it ran through television, and then SEAI took it up as a social media campaign. And it
Yeah.
was about how one person can make a difference. And I mean, that is very true. If we all act all together, if we act together, it works. But what it also does is it makes us feel we're the ones who have to do it, and we're on our own. And if we don't do it, there's something wrong with us. Whereas if you work together from the get-go, so let's work collectively within communities, within groups, you then work together. There's peer pressure because you're all in there trying to do things together, and you're putting pressure on each other maybe to do things better. There's a sense of camaraderie. It can be quite fun. And there isn't this sense of fear that maybe if I step too far, I'm going to be judged by people. When you go together, it's a much more safe kind of way of doing it. And I mean, if you look at society, you can break us down into three groups. One group is the early adopters. They're out there, they're at the edge. Environmentalists probably are there trying new things. We're risk takers. And then you'd have prospectors, the progressive people in the middle, and they would be looking at how do we progress jobs, how do we give people good incomes, how do we make sure that there's a good economy. And then the third group is what they call settlers, and they're people who maybe you could say they're a little set in their ways, but they
Yeah.
are very good at preserving history, and they may not be so likely to change. So when you're talking about climate action, it's important that you understand that there's different kinds of people possibly in the room, or you're trying to give the message to different kinds of people out there. So one of the mistakes we made within the environmental movement was, I think, and we're learning now not to do it, but we were thinking that everyone was like us. So we would give the
Yeah.
message in the way that we could understand it, and the
Oh,
message
okay.
would energize us. But we didn't realize that there was a third of the people were worried about the economy and saying, what on earth are you saying? Because will that create jobs? What about the stability? And others were saying, you know what, that's it's not so right to change. And, why would we when we have to preserve this? And
And what about how good it is now, and why would we change what we're
yes,
doing because it's so nice to live right now? Yeah, so I understand.
that's it.
What I find so interesting about this is that you are almost using these psychological strategies that were working against you, and you're almost using them now in your arsenal to promote action.
Yeah, and I think that's, you see, very practical, because if you're trying to go against the grain, it's really tough. Whereas if you go with the grain, you have a better chance. Now, I'm not saying it's plain sailing, because there is an inert fear in us to think that something bad is going to happen. It's called the optimism bias. We kind of want to believe everything is grand. So, it'll be fine. And we hear it all the time. And that's a very necessary part of our psychology, because we need hope, and we need to know that things are going to be good in the future for our children. So giving people bad news is not necessarily the answer. So again, I think in the past, a lot of us were telling people how bad it's going to get. So we thought that if we give the apocalyptic view of storms, floods, whatever, and this is how it'll affect you if you don't act now, we thought that that would actually help to activate people. And because it had activated us, because we understood the context within which those messages were being given. But for
Yeah.
people who don't know anything about climate change and who live their lives in a different way and have different priorities and maybe different values, that
Yeah.
doesn't work at all. And it can actually be counterproductive. So it can
Hmm.
push people into denial or into
Mm.
apathy. And denial, again, is a very good kind of trait to have in that it helps you through the bad times. Like if we really took to heart a very, a big crisis and we really kind of took it on board, we can get depressed, or we could get into a very kind of poor state of mind. So denial sometimes helps us through that by saying,
Mm.
it's not happening, or it's not happening that way, and why, there's nothing I can do anyway. But it isn't great if we're trying to get people to act, because we don't want
Right.
them to go into this cage and say, well, there's nothing I can do, and it's not happening. And apathy is the other problem, in that people then could sit back and say, if it's such a big problem, what can I do? There's
Mm.
nothing I can do, which is another argument for collective action. Well, actually, if you do it with your neighbours and your family and others, then you can. Another thing I've learned is that if people take an action, particularly if it's something that may be difficult for them, or they feel they're losing something if they act, they need to
Mm.
know they're making a difference, and they need to know that that action is worth it.
Hmm.
So that's again the point of being within a project or within a group where you're learning why you're doing it and you're learning the impact of it.
Because we all know that when you do something on your own, you don't get maybe as much done.
Mm,
When you work in a group, you tend to. I mean, most people work in teams
yeah,
in work,
yeah,
and you work in a team because somehow you get a lot more done. That makes perfect sense that, we use it in the workforce all the time. We should use it
yeah.
for these more social issues.
But we also have to bear in mind that some people are more introverted, and I think that showed through the pandemic that actually some people felt the
Mm,
pressure was off to socialize and to be in teams, so
great
they were
point.
happy enough to work on their own. So there are
Mm,
introverts who may find that more challenging, but their skills can still come into a project. They can contribute by doing some research, or by you know organizing some event or whatever. But
the many things that they could do where
yeah,
they don't have to go up and speak with all the community.
that's it. They
Yeah.
don't have to be giving the speech or organizing the people. They can be doing background work. So again, when you're
Mm.
working with people, it's about recognizing people's strengths and what energizes them and what de-energizes them.
I just kind of had a thought as well. The fact that a lot of stuff is moved remotely and we now have this kind of infrastructure to work remotely, that's probably even more good for people who are introverted to get involved in things. They're like, oh God, I don't want to go to that big town hall event.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, maybe I can just, we can have a Zoom stream going,
that's it.
and people can be involved in that way
Yeah,
and feel more comfortable in doing
yeah.
so.
And also, I mean, it really has helped organize people or bring people to meetings. If it would have caused a lot of traveling or having to get a babysitter or whatever, you can now have a Zoom meeting wherever everyone can tune in for the hour, and it doesn't
Yeah.
take an hour on either side to either organize or to get there. So it gives you more options. But we did notice during the pandemic that we missed the in-person meetings in community,
Mm,
because there's something you miss when you're not with people. You can
absolutely.
engage, but there's something about even putting your arm on someone's arm or giving a hug. That physical contact with people.
Yeah.
It's really important for us. So you need a blended mix, I think, of it. It's neither one way or the other.
Okay. And that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
That sense of camaraderie, it tends to start when you're physically there with people. You're
Mm,
doing it together. You feel more connected.
yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. You talked about climate denial, or maybe just denial in general, and apathy. But another thing that keeps coming up is climate anxiety.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? How
Yeah.
how does that work?
I haven't read a huge amount of research on it, but just kind of watching and anecdotally hearing stories, I do think
Mm,
that there are, and I would know some people who have worked in the environmental movement for years. It is very hard if you truly get the science, and you really have read into it and you may have worked in it
mm,
for years.
mm,
There is an anxiety emerging now because the pace of change seems to be quite slow. and we have this deadline now, so we
Yeah.
feel we have to have major changes done by 2030 and then 2050. And if you look at where we're at now, our emissions aren't going down, so we bounced back after the pandemic in terms of driving, and, we still kept using a lot of energy in the pandemic anyway. And I think people feel a bit despondent, and anxiety comes in then because you just feel anxious about the future, and you feel that what you're doing isn't having a huge impact. Because there would be times I'd be kind of, I would not read something because I don't want to read that latest scientific report. I don't want to, because
Yeah.
I know what's in it. What I try to do is actually look at where, I mean, I'm in a lucky position because I work with Mara. I do have an open door into policy circles. So I do meet with policymakers now and then, and I can see that there is a lot of work happening behind the scenes, So there's a lot of preparatory work happening within the departments, within state bodies, within businesses, which you would hope then will start to bear fruit in a couple of years' time. So if you're doing massive change, you can't just flip into it. You have to
Absolutely.
change people's ways of doing it, the infrastructure, whatever. So all that does take time. So I feel the next kind of 3 to 5 years are critical, and we need to see that things are progressing during those years. Where I feel that the anxiety has been felt most at the moment is probably with young people. They have come to it, in a fairly full-on way, over the last few years, and it's like they got the whole kind of truth of it within
Absolutely.
a year, and then there were the
Yeah.
climate strikes and those amazing kind of young people coming out and getting actively involved, and they had a huge impact. Like, I'm sure they know the impact they've had, but I can definitely say I've seen it within parents, within policymakers. Most people, if they're not a parent, have nieces or nephews or have young people somewhere in their family circle. And it was very, very important for people to be given a good kick by the young people. So they've done us a massive service. But I
Yeah.
think for some of them, by taking such a great leap into the issue, they're wondering what their future holds. So for some, I think they have to be supported, and we have to be mindful that with our messaging, that we don't push them further into anxiety, and that we do respect their wish for change, because it's very
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
So there's a really big balance here. Now, that's really what I wanted to also talk to you about was, I'm nearly not a young person, but I would consider myself still a
And
young
I'm
person.
definitely not young.
But I feel that young people, specifically on all of the different social medias, people are scared of climate change. It's not because young people tend to feel like they can do less than people who are older and have more maybe higher up jobs and more power and more influence, and etc., etc. I think that is maybe something that governments really need to work on, and organizations should maybe, you talked about there's 3 types of people. Well, there's also different age ranges of
That's it.
people.
Yeah.
So it's like maybe the strategies for communicating to people should be different, not only within their, what bracket would you say you put them in. Maybe there might also be another variable there is age bracket.
Young and the old divide. We have to be very careful that that doesn't happen, because if you look in society, older folk have more money in general, that they have savings, or they have a pension coming through, or whatever, or they have bought their house. Not everyone, obviously, but young people are struggling with all of those life changes and life steps. So yeah. I mean, I always think that the antidote to climate anxiety is climate action, and I think if we act, we feel we're doing something about it. That it is very hard if we just read and we absorb the awful kind of messaging around how it can be or could be. So it's really good to get stuck in, get involved, because you get a sense of agency then, and you feel you're trying to do something about it, and you're having your say. So that's step one. But the other thing, what gave me great solace, I think, is reading history and looking at historical documentaries. And I mean, I don't know if this is a thing, but for me it really worked, because I realized that I was looking back and reading about the First World War, the Second World War, the famine. It's quite eclectic in my reading choices, but I was seeing how society came out of massive difficulties, and challenges.
Yeah.
And I think we have to hope and have the hope that we will get through this,
Yeah.
and the vision is that we will go to a better place, because we all want life to be better. And the truth is, if we can change our actions for whatever reason, but if they are related to emissions, we will end up with quieter cities, hopefully less stressed life, better communities. We'll be doing stuff more locally. We'll have more local jobs. We'll be producing food locally. All the different actions that are required actually may make our lives easier, because we feel that at the moment our lives, it would be awful if we changed them. But we can all think of aspects of our lives that we could do with changing, and that we maybe don't need to have so much stuff. Why are we consuming so much? It's like it's this treadmill we're on. And to make ourselves feel better, we buy something else, So rather than looking within and trying to becoming calmer and maybe more mindful, we're hanging on to consumerism and shopping to kind of solve that for us, or racing off on a holiday. I'm kind of intrigued, and I understand it. Like, we've had 2 years of a pandemic, and we're all bursting to get to the sun or to get to a 2-week holiday. Is it going to be the wonderful holiday we think it will be that'll solve all our woes? We always have something outside of ourselves that we think will improve how we feel or how we look, whereas really maybe if climate change and climate action helps us to step back a little bit from that, to do less of it, and to look at what's important to us in our lives, and in within our own well-being.
It almost feels like this movement, and it's more than a movement now. I feel like it's everywhere. Almost everyone could benefit from this.
Yeah.
One more question I wanted to ask you before talking about some of the specific projects that you've been involved in. I really want to hit home this message here with how we can better promote action. What are ways that governments and organizations can encourage people to act more on climate change? And what have you found works and what doesn't?
Well, I suppose speaking directly to what I've ended up doing is we really feel that resources should go into communities. Resources should be spent on projects and initiatives that are working with people on the ground. There's a danger that a lot of money will go into a new website or a new way of spreading information, or something that will be national. We will do one big thing and that will change everything, and it can often, so there, I think it was about 2008, there was a big website with a carbon calculator put on it. And the idea was that everyone would go in and calculate their carbon usage. Sure, of course, people didn't go in and use it, and it had cost a lot of money to do that. So what we're learning in Dingle is very much you need to support and empower people to come to the table. That that takes time, it takes effort, and people may not be queuing up at the door to join or to get involved in projects. So you need to kind of go out there and draw people in, and that takes resources. But the other layer, I'm saying don't just give information, but you do need to give information as part of the mix. So it's really a 10-pronged approach, probably, one of which is very much work locally. There's different layers of what else we need to do, but one is clear messaging. I think people are confused, so they hear one message from someone, then they hear something about agriculture, then they hear about something about, retrofitting or cutting out meat, or you have to use public transport. It's like it's coming, really hard and fast.
Cacophony of,
And you think, well, I can't change everything, and I'm not going to do all that tomorrow. Sure, I might as well stay where I am, because I don't know where to start,
Yeah, and then the denial hits in, and then everything.
Yeah,
and it's just
or you
like
feel resentful. There's a kickback, because that can happen. If you feel you're being blamed because people are saying you're not doing enough, then all this stuff comes at you, and you get a little bit belligerent and say, listen, what are you doing up there? What are you as a government doing? So we need to see leadership from the government, and also from public representatives and people in the public eye. We need to see how more of them are changing their lives. Whose house has been retrofitted? Let's have a look around some well-known person's house and how they're doing it. We need more of that kind of examples from the top, and we need more
Yeah.
policies from the top, but we then also need the thought leaders. Like every community has very well respected people within the community.
Mhm.
So we need
Mhm.
to draw those people in, who then other people will change because they see those well respected people getting involved, so it's about getting the thought leaders at the top and at the bottom visibly acting and getting involved.
You mentioned Dingle, and I really want to learn more about that. I think you're talking about the Dingle Peninsula 2030 project.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you tell me a bit about the work? Well, tell me all about
Okay.
the work you've done in that, and if you want to talk about any of the other projects or anything else that you've learned that you want people to really think about.
In early 2018, the Dingle Hub, based in Dingletown on the peninsula, there was a guy called Brendan Toohey who used to work in the civil service. He is actually chairperson of Marai, and he also is a board member of and helped to set up the Dingle Hub. So he
Yeah.
came up with this idea, and often projects begin with one person's idea and one person's vision, and this is a good example of it. He created this vision of trying to transition the whole of the Dingle Peninsula to a low carbon future. That the peninsula
Wow.
looks at its emissions in all ways, transport, agriculture, houses, whatever, heat. So
Everything.
what he did was he drew people together. So we're 4 agencies coming together, and each with different things that we wanted to do. We wanted to do a bit of research and working out, community, how do you engage community. The ESB networks wanted to do trials on literally energy trials in people's homes. Newcould were
Yeah.
interested in the community development aspect, and Dingle Hub were kind of the mainstay of it, but they also had a need to see that jobs would be created out of it. So we
Yeah,
came
absolutely.
together as what we now call, or we then started calling, a collaboration, a collaborative initiative. And we
Yeah.
started having monthly meetings and being very clear. Our main aim was that we didn't, as 4 agencies, bamboozle the local community. We wanted to involve them, but we didn't want to confuse them, and we didn't want to be doing things separately on or with the community and then overdoing it. So we had a very coordinated approach from the beginning, and a great little team of people. So we started setting up projects, and ESB networks were straight off the gun because they put a call out looking for people to volunteer to have their houses retrofitted. So they chose 5 ambassadors, and they retrofitted their houses. They then gave 20 solar panels to 20 households. They did some battery trials, and then in the last year they gave electric cars to 15 people to trial them for a year. Now, unfortunately, the pandemic hit in the middle of that. So a lot of the
course.
activities that we were trying to do and hoping to do around that, we had to do online. But still, it worked out. So they did their 3-year project. Dingle Hub got involved in various different projects, particularly working with farmers. There's a big project there now linked to the EU Plutus project, where they have sensors on 30 farms, where they're looking at moisture meters, and they're looking at various aspects of their soil management and grass management. There's also an energy West Dairy Farmers SEC. So they are looking at their sustainable energy, and they're looking at maybe collectively putting solar panels on their roofs. We ran a course for community energy mentors with Kerry Education Training Board. So we upskilled 10 people around the issues, and we're hoping that they're now diffusing into the community and helping to get other people involved. So we're trying to kind of be multi-pronged, get people involved in projects so they become active, and then they, particularly in the ESB networks trials, people then were ambassadors within their communities and within their friends, their circle of friends, helping to encourage them to retrofit. Now, a lot of the changes will be not short term. We're already seeing more solar panels on the Dingle Peninsula than in other areas.
Yeah.
So it's beginning to filter through, and we call it the diffusion of sustainability. But we won't really see the full impact, for quite a few years.
The strategy seems to be the best strategy to start from the ground up
Yeah.
rather than from the top down.
Yes, and we were lucky with Dingle in that we had Brendan, so we've also been able to bring in national stakeholders. So we call ourselves kind of hybrid. We started on the ground, but we brought in kind of ESB networks would be a national agency, Marai is, but we did it both, and we have connections and we have partnerships in projects with Gas Networks Ireland. They gave money for feasibility study to an anaerobic digester. We've got Kerry Education Training Board, we've got SEAI linked in. So we're drawing in, and we actually had Minister Eamon Ryan down last Friday for a visit, so
Brilliant.
we see our role, it's an experiment and it's a pilot project. So we're willing to trial, and we were lucky in that we had the money from the 4 agencies to pay those of us involved. It's been hard to get other grants, but we've managed to get a few. But we were lucky in that we were able to provide people to start this work on the ground through the different agencies. It's much harder if you're starting from scratch with a bunch of volunteers, because you don't necessarily have people to do the coordination or the project management.
Yeah.
What we're also doing down there, and that's really Marai's kind of input, we're doing what we call reflective learning and evaluation. So we're keeping track of what's going on down there. And a lot of my role is co-creating with the team down there, actually looking at what have we been doing, what are we learning from it, what maybe hasn't worked, what could work better, what are our recommendations for policies. So on our website we have, I think it's about 13 what we're calling learning briefs. So we put them then in writing, and we agree that what comes out as the finished product. And the idea is that it's available then, apart from us learning from the process, because when you go through this evaluative kind of process, you really understand what you're doing, and you don't make the same mistake again, or you learn from on what you can build, But we've benefited from that, but we also have those written pieces that are available for other groups to read, and for policymakers and whoever wants to read them. And the hope is that maybe some people won't maybe go down that route, because we've shown, well, actually we had to segue from that route because that didn't quite work. Or this, or they might get some inspiration from some of the things we've done.
Absolutely. And what is your vision for our future in terms of environmental action? Do you see projects like the Dingle Peninsula 2030 scattered across the country? Is that how you see this happening? Some funding from the top, but also some from the bottom.
Yeah.
Is that how you see us actually really making this national?
Yeah, I mean, I think to draw people in on the ground, you have to have something local happening. And I mean, there are other groups out there. So there's sustainable energy communities that are under the wing of SCAI, Sustainable Energy Ireland Authority, but a lot of them are voluntary, so there's community energy groups as well. And, Temple Dairy have set up a community energy wind farm. So there is stuff happening out there. So we're not the only ones. I mean, I have to say that.
Of course.
But we're doing it probably in a bigger way because we had more people and more resources to set it up.
Yeah.
And we're doing it kind of trying to look at the whole area and every aspect of life and energy use, etc. But I think it will not spread if it isn't resourced. There's no question about that. Like, groups just cannot spring from being a voluntary group where people are working hard, they have their own lives, and they're coming together for meetings every now and then some people are putting a hell of a lot of work in their spare time, but it is never enough, and burnout can happen.
In each local region, there needs to be a core team of people who are there. It's their jobs. They're paid to do this.
There are certain skills required for this because it isn't easy. I mean, I have to be honest. We could say, it's brilliant what we're doing down in Dingle, but there are challenges, and some people, there might be local resistance in the area for whatever against a wind farm, or there may be people feeling really put upon because they can't grow or cut peat anymore. There may be local resistance. So you have to be very skilled, I think, to draw people in rather than causing a conflict and having another divide within the community. So community work and community development is a skill, and
Absolutely.
We can't presume that people can. I mean, some people have it instinctively, in fairness, and they don't need to be trained, and they're just brilliant at it. But we can't presume that you can dump, say, an engineer he knows all about renewable energy into coordinating stuff with it. There's a different skill set, So it has to be resourced, but also we have to accept that every community is different. So people often ask us, can you provide a blueprint then for other communities from what you're doing in Dingle? And I straight away say no, because actually Brendan Toohey isn't in every community, as an example. It started up the way it started because he was the initiator, and another community may have another initiator with other ideas and other ways of. There's many ways of skinning this cat. You can come at it from different directions. So it's about trying to provide resources for the coordination and the engagement on all that work, but allowing the community to kind of decide what they're going to tackle first, which projects they want to go for, what their interests are, whether it's biodiversity or agriculture or transport, and then they can build on that later on. But the resourcing is key. Yeah.
So we need to resource and we need to train some community engagement officers across the country.
It's a tricky one because we've thought about it in Mara. Do you set up a university course? Do you do an adult education course? What do you do? Do the education training boards maybe run it, or do you mentor people, because someone may be in the role and they're just struggling because they don't have a full skill set. So do you give them kind of bite-sized courses?
Almost like an apprenticeship.
Yeah. Because, it can be off-putting if it doesn't work. Or if you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, I've just exploded the community, or something has happened that really failed. Maybe networks and support kind of organizations. But again, they don't run on their own voluntary steam. Again, they have to be resourced. And I mean, I know it's awful to keep talking about money, but in relation to climate change, it is a saving. If we invest now in communities, we're not going to be paying the fines to Europe because we haven't met our targets.
Our carbon.
We're not going to be hopefully dealing with the worst effects of climate change down the tracks, which will cost a fortune. That we would be putting in the building blocks to help us to make the changes. So it's actually an investment in the future rather than just giving money to local communities.
Not to mention we might actually create even more jobs and better cost of living and all of this stuff.
And this is where the hubs come in. So there is a push to have more of the hubs involved in this kind of work. And I know Ludgate Hub, in my neighbouring Skibbereen, I live in Ballydehob, they're very keen now to move into this sustainability space, because what they've shown in Dingle is that the hub is there to give people work desks, to help them set up businesses, to help create jobs, but they are very much in the space of supporting changes within the community, and they see sustainability as being the way forward for jobs. Retrofitting would bring in loads of local jobs if we really get going on it, and I mean local transport and setting up local tourism. They're looking at tourism. How can you do it in a more sustainable way down there? So that'll bring in more little businesses and more, farm diversification, go into ecotourism, have less cattle maybe, so it is all tied up with our economy and with jobs anyway, which can only be good.
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation, and I really think that this will stir a lot of action and ideas in our audience's minds. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Aidan.
This is the end of the podcast. We hope you enjoyed your time. If you're feeling generous and you're not completely skinned, why don't you give us some of your money? Join our Patreon. Join our Patreon. Join our Patreon. Join our Patreon.